public authority doesn't care about you. Public authority doesn't need you. So they're not asking for your, this is what the truth of post-mass politics is that maybe some religions are asking for your involvement, particularly in terms of radical Islam, etc. But by and large, no one's really asking for your attention, for your loyalty, for your commitment, and for your active participation.
Or maybe they are asking for your attention more than your commitment.
Right.
Spectate, believe. You don't have to belong. You don't have to do anything. Just kind of, But
you can spectate. You can spectate at many things, and it's a fairly passive.
It's fairly low. Yeah, you can multi-screen. All the different things you need to spectate.
That's good. Nice. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. I'm Alex Hochuli in São Paulo, Brazil. And this podcast, insofar as it's in its form as Reading Club, is George Hoare in London and Phil Cunliffe in Canterbury.
It is.
Ramsgate. Well, force of habit. I can't,
Lately of Canterbury.
Yeah.
Lately of Canterbury, that's right.
Disgruntled of Canterbury, yeah. This time, exceptionally, we are releasing this to Gen Pop, which maybe includes you, listener. Maybe you're already a member, but this is, I think, an opportunity for us to say what we're doing here in this reading club and to encourage you to sign up if you're interested in stuff like this. We're here discussing kind of the famous work on the invention of tradition, and hopefully, in releasing this for free, we'll generate mass produce loyalty to BungaCast. That's the aim.
And you invented tradition.
Exactly. We're now recording the second episode in this second part of the Reading Club, the second block, which is to remind you on nationalism and internationalism in the 21st century. The March episode was late. It just came out recently in April. So this one you're hearing, a mere few weeks after the previous one, and we're discussing Eric Hobsbawm's The Invention of Tradition, actually co-authored book, co-edited. I'm not going to do this. This is Phil to describe, but this follows on from the episode which we did previously. We started with internationalism and Perry Anderson and the way that he charts internationalism against nationalism from the period of the Atlantic revolutions through to today. And today we're talking about made up stuff. Phil.
Yeah, so just to, I suppose, develop the theme that we talked about last time, which is the inspiration for this particular part of the Reading Club. I suppose the first era, so-called, of globalization in the late 19th century up to the outbreak of the First World War was defined by its slow coming of geopolitical rivalry, nationalism and various kinds of chauvinisms and imperialism pulled that world apart. But the sense of it was very much that it was a world pulled apart by these powerful atavistic forces, insurgent forces, various ethnic and nationalistic revolts against the major empires, some of which directly, obviously, notoriously detonated the outbreak of the First World War itself. And now, in keeping with the theme of the podcast, that we're at the end of history, so we're seeing the collapse of the end of history globalization, the period since the end of the Cold War over the last 30 years, defined by intensive global economic integration under American unipolarity, and that's breaking down. But it's not really breaking down from this upsurge of ethnic tensions. I mean, obviously there's geopolitical rivalry between China and America, most notably, but also Russia and India to a lesser extent. But none of it really has the force or dynamism or drive associated with the aspiration to establish new nation states and to pull apart the great cosmopolitan empires of the first era of globalization. So it feels more like what we're dealing with is the disintegration of a global order. And that's been a theme that we've developed on the podcast for a while, the disintegration of neoliberal globalization. So we're drawing on the effort to study the political formations of national identity that came out of this earlier period. And we've looked at Eric Hobsbawm's work previously, particularly his Nations and Nationalism, whereas this is a collection of essays that he put together with Terrence Ranger, who was a specialist on Africa, and they collected a range of historians it's an edited collection. They collected a range of historians to develop points. And to their credit, range, in terms of the ideological and political spectrum, it was a range of historians from indicating diversity, ideological diversity. They included Hugh Trevor-Roper, for instance, who famously a Tory historian, to look at the formation of ideas that we associate with Scottish identity today, notably various associations of kilt patterns with clan identity in Scotland, something which is assumed to be deeply organic and inherited from time immemorial, as Tony Soprano would say, but in fact is something that emerged fairly recently in the 19th century, forming modern Scottish identity. And this is a theme that repeats across the work.
On this, just to interrupt, I'm pretty sure I've read that essay a while ago, and the idea is that tartan, which is this kind of
tartan, not
is the soul of like Scotland, was actually just a leftover print design that a manufacturer had, and they thought, we know how we can sell this. We can say it is the soul of Scotland, and that I think is a really good example. I mean, might be particularly British, but if you know the association of tartan and Scotland, to realise that actually it's modern and it's recent. It's not from time immemorial.
Yeah. And this is it's the very famous example, and it comes, as we said, from Hugh Trevor-Roper's essay rather than from either Terrence Ranger's or Hobsbawm's essays. But it's the basic theme, or the reason it's a famous example is because it contains within it the argument of the entire collection of essays. So traditions that are assumed or treated with a certain degree of reverence as if they're organic inheritances from the past, but in fact they're invented. The invention of tradition to legitimize various kinds of identities, and also to adapt to the stresses of modern society. So to allow societies to adapt themselves, particularly traditional or marginal societies in places such as the colonial empires in Africa, or as the Scottish Highland, the example of the Scottish Highlands on the rim of an industrializing nation such as Britain, how they transform their identities in order to meet new needs. And there's various case studies, as I mentioned, European, colonial, imperial, to show how various rituals, symbols are created in order to project continuity with a past that is essentially fabricated. And so Hobsbawm defines these invented traditions. This is a quote from the first page: a set of practices normally governed by overtly or tacitly accepted rules and of a ritual or symbolic nature, which seek to inculcate certain values and norms of behavior by repetition, which automatically implies continuity with the past. So it's the repetition of the ritual that is deliberately designed to inculcate the sense of unbroken continuity with some past, but the past is in fact mythical, and in fact it's manufactured retrospectively through the repetition, this automaticity and repetition of the ritual. And so he distinguishes between organic traditions and those that are more self-consciously designed by elites in order to consolidate power or national identity. And it's an argument, this invention of tradition argument is associated with periods of tremendous social dislocation and change, industrialization in the core of the global economy and colonialism on its periphery. So the chapter we're focusing on is Hobsbawm's chapter, Mass Producing Traditions, Europe 1870 to 1914, the first year of globalization, as I mentioned. And this discusses national anthems, public ceremonies, pageantry, which were used to weld together modern nation states. And Hobsbawm very explicitly ties this to industrialization and the emergence of mass politics in this period. These symbols were self-consciously, if not necessarily, they didn't spring fully formed. There was a process of creation and a certain degree of haphazard evolution, but nonetheless, there was self-conscious effort and intention to carve out symbols that would foster loyalty in this period of tremendous change. So the argument is traditions are dynamic. and that they arise in contexts of social disruption when you have the need to anchor identity and with it political authority. And so the thrust of the argument is to cut against these ideas of organic inherited traditions, or well, more romantic notions, I suppose, of what a tradition might be.
Yeah, not to preempt the future discussion, but it is just quite striking that tradition is one of the central ideas, I guess, of conservative thought. And the idea would be we just retain the best from previous generations and we kind of filter it through, and the bad ones just fade away, and we're just left with basically the best of our inheritance as a nation or a people or a culture or whatever. And this book is like, no, that's actually bullshit. To be fair.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's very much, it undercuts the kind of the idea that a conservative inheritance or an inheritance from the past is a meaningful basis for governing society, because it is in fact retrospectively manufactured.
Well, I mean, just two meta comments, one less serious, the other a little bit more. Obviously, there's the type of fallacy, which is a form of circular reasoning called the no true Scotsman fallacy, which apparently was coined in 1975, which is more recent than I thought, which is apposite, I guess. It was coined apparently by a British philosopher called Anthony Flew. But, without the knowledge of the invention of tradition, and specifically the cases of Scotland, of the invention of kind of tartan and clan ties and whatever, there could have been a sense of what a true Scotsman was. But of course, because it's self-defining, you can say no true Scotsman, and you're defining the category of a true Scotsman, and therefore, it's a circular form of reasoning. It's a good example of the invention of tradition, or indeed a fallacy that only becomes a fallacy because of the invention of tradition. More seriously, though, the point, Peter Burke, the kind of early modern historian of early modern Europe, wrote in this piece where I was kind of looking up about the Brazilian reception of the invention of tradition, because I think we're going to talk about some kind of examples earlier. And there's this piece, he's married to a Brazilian and wrote a piece in Folha de São Paulo, which is Brazil's paper of record. This came out already in 2001, commenting on this book. And I mean, he remarks firstly that it's rare that an academic conference generates a bestseller. Edited collections rarely fly off the shelves, but publishers aren't generally that even interested in them because of that reason. And this was a rare case where they obviously struck on something. This academic conference about the invention tradition really caught the times. We've talked, I think, not even in this block of the reading club, but previously when we've done something on nations and nationalism. I think when we did Eric Hobsbawm's book. That this period of the 1980s, where there was this certain upsurge of studies of nationalism, that it was a sort of Owl of Minerva moment, that it was kind of the waning of nationalism, and that's why suddenly all these scholars cottoned on to this idea and started to analyze critically the formation of nations, nationalisms, etc. And he points out, this is Peter Burke in this essay about or it's just an article about this edited collection, is that he kind of says it's a bit postmodern, and he's aware that that's a bit ironic because Hobsbawm, as a Marxist of the old school and a person like Hugh Trevor Roper, a conservative, could never be tarnished with that brush, tarred with that brush of postmodernism. And yet there is something in quote marks postmodern about it, insofar as it deals with social construction, about the invention, about imagination, whatever. And he traces this to postmodern thought, and indeed back to 68 and this idea of self-creation, of creating the world, of imagining a new world, the beach below the paving stones, etc., all the cliches.
Yeah, I mean, that latter bit, it's interesting you bring the review up. I'm not familiar with it, but now mentioning it, I did, now that you mention it, I do recall that it was the proceeds of an academic conference. It's a short book. I suppose it has that advantage, but it certainly, the fact it was so popular was that it captured this moment of this early phase of globalization as it began to stir. And I suppose, even though perhaps I wouldn't go as far as to say you can see the imprint of 1968 on the basic thesis, I certainly think you could perhaps explain the fact that people were more receptive to this kind of argument in a world in which you had this kind of globalist, consumerist outlook breaking through the world of Cold War alliance blocks and hermetically sealed geopolitical spheres of influence. And in that context, people would be more willing to kind of buy this idea that, like George said, this notion that tartan came from a scrap of something which some guy had the idea to use to sell as the basis of the soul of Scotland. And I think that would be something that people would get intuitively in that context when ethnic food was kind of becoming a more popular thing. National cuisines were, kind of fusion cuisine would be something familiar in more urban parts of the world. And in that context, you could see that idea. Anyway, before we got into it, I wanted to ask you guys if you can think of one tradition. Well, first of all, you have to tell us within your own nation's, from your own nation's kind of background, that you like and subscribe to. It might be manufactured or it might be organic. You have to decide which it is. But say, like, kind of give us an idea of a tradition that is something you would support, whether it's fake in this Hobsbawmian sense or not.
Well, I can have a go at this one from the English or British perspective. I guess sometimes when you're thinking about these traditions, it's like caricatures or like what are the aspects of this really kind of stereotypical, exaggerated national identity that you can just about bear. I just had a cup of tea and I really nailed it. I really made a good cup of tea, and I had it at tea time, which is 4 o'clock. And yeah, I mean, I didn't do the full high tea or the full
Did you
tea.
use a tea bag?
I did use a tea bag.
That's
I'd
not
sometimes,
tradition, then, is it? There.
no, I mean, that's true. I sometimes use loose leaf, but this was a tea bag. It was Waitrose though, so I mean, I was not
Even
slumming it too
worse.
much.
Even worse.
So,
Their invented tradition right there.
but I think, yeah, I mean, we can get on to I think the ceremonies of state I find a bit harder to throw my weight behind, but some of don't want to talk too much about football, but there is mention of sports and football in the article. So Phil, don't worry, we will get onto that. You're not going to escape that fully. But no, I think there is something about, the consumption aspect of like food and drink, which going to the pub, that's what I should have said.
But
that is a national tradition.
It's funny. Is that a tradition? I mean, 'cause it is a tradition in the sense of it being a widespread habit and practice, which is shared. But does it take on a symbolic function in terms of symbolizing the nation? I think going to the pub, is right. I think just consuming tea. Not really. Everybody has their stimulant of choice in every country.
Once upon a time, I think it would have had that sense of, it would have conveyed, it doesn't anymore, and it's been replaced by coffee. And then, tea initially kind of replaced coffee because, famously coffee was the drink of the stockbrokers in Threadneedle Street and whatnot, the early merchant class. But I think it did because it was kind of associated with, they made sure tea rations came in during the Second World War. There was that sense of stoicism, calmness. There was, I think that's important, but that's gone. I think, tea is something I associate with my grandparents, and it doesn't really exist anymore.
Someone's going to quote you on this and be like, tea doesn't really exist anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. Quote me by all means.
No, I mean, you can say tea doesn't exist. I'll say Germany doesn't exist. We need to keep a running list of things that we think don't exist.
All right, tell us about Brazil, Alex. What is the Brazilian tradition?
I wasn't socialized in this country, so it's hard to
all the more reason that you can
comment.
claim its traditions.
Yeah, or perhaps have enough distance to them to observe them in a way that when you're.
Would you take as no? But okay, but so what?
I can answer for you.
Yeah, we can answer
Alex.
For you if you like. Samba's great. Like
Carnival.
Carnival's a great tradition. There you go. Yeah.
I mean, there's a well, we'll come on to this because I think we're going to talk about this later. I have prepared some comments about Brazil and the invention tradition, which I think is interesting to make the contrast to Europe, But I think we're going to do that later on.
Okay, but choose a tradition to get us started.
No, I mean, Carnival.
One
Yeah,
of the many
participation
countries to which
Carnival.
you're a citizen. At least choose one from one of those countries. Give us.
Yeah, no, Carnival. Carnival's good.
Carnival's great.
I miss, when I think about Britain, the thing that I most miss in terms of living there, actually, arguably the only thing that I miss in terms of not, specific individuals.
The people?
But,
okay, I thought.
Yeah. No, leaving aside specific individuals, thing I miss about living there, probably the only thing is like going to the pub and then, associated with like watching. So I miss both a pub and I miss the pub specifically insofar as that signifies like your own local. That's something which I miss and is part of, I think, is certainly part of the national imaginary, part of the national self-conception is like, this is something that we do. I don't know what purpose it serves politically or socially nowadays. But I think that's part of the discussion we're going to come on to as well.
Yeah, well, it's dying. I mean, that's the other point of it. So it's something which is a tradition that's definitely withering away.
Yeah, criminal.
Alcohol duty, the banning of smoking indoors, the
Rent
almost effort to
prices, yeah.
ban smoking outdoors, and property prices in urban centres, the general kind of erosion of nightlife under these under the kind of process of developers, large wealthy developers controlling nightlife forums in cities, but also lockdown and general atomization, I think, as well as cultural change. So, people, Zoomers don't drink. The degree of the population that is, the millions of people that have arrived recently have less attachment either to drinking or to drinking in the pub. And so it is a tradition that's dying, which might not, so it is the tradition I would definitely choose as my favorite one of the British/English traditions you could subscribe to.
What, not like lathing yourself in poppy emblazoned garb at every possible moment throughout October,
No,
November.
definitely not. And
Se-
that,
and September.
interestingly, that
And
Well, there
itself,
you go.
no, there was a moment of that, and it's gone as well. Like
Already?
it's really,
Huh.
yes, it's really strong. I mean, maybe listeners, viewers can tell me. This is something I noticed. Maybe I don't know if George, if you feel the same. I thought it was distinctly absent in the last couple of years, and I don't really know why. And I've seen fewer poppy sellers about, and I'm not sure. So I'm not sure what happened.
I would tend to agree with you. I put this down to there was a picture that went round of Cookie Monster from Sesame Street appearing on a daytime TV show with a poppy on, and I think that just was the beginning of the end of the poppy, because that's going too far. Cookie Monster shouldn't be in the same world that you have World War One. I just don't think that's compatible.
Right.
Yeah. No, I never wore a poppy. Even before I was, kind of politically self-conscious or not. I can't remember ever putting one on, but that was a family tradition actually, rather than a national one, because my grandfather, disabled Dunkirk veteran, never wore one, even though he said he loved the army and the rest of it, and I don't think he had any kind of compunctions about having fought for the country, but he never kind of could never get behind the poppy thing. Long before it became Sesame Street. So anyway, let us talk about Mr. Hobsbawm and Ranger's book. So we're talking about Eric Hobsbawm's chapter, and he says it is this period that we mentioned, 1870 to 1914, famously this period of empires, industrialization, and the rise of nationalism. So why is this period so important for Hobsbawm? And also that makes it seemingly such a fertile ground for inventing traditions. Is it simply the need for stability, or is something larger at play?
Yeah, I mean, this is the sort of starting question of Mr. Hobsbawm's chapter. He asked, like, why is it that so many traditions emerge in this period? And it's worth saying this is, as you were saying, this is kind of he has this, and I would imagine listeners might well already know this, but he has these three books on the long 19th century. So 1789 to 1848, sorry, is the age of revolution. Then 1848 to 18. I'm just getting ahead of myself. To 1875 is the age of capital. So it's slightly different because this is 1870, and then 1875 to 1914 is the age of empire. So he's associating it with that last third of the long 19th century, and he says, yeah, this is the period where the depth and the pace of change, socially and economically, traditional forms of rule become more difficult. The state comes to define citizens' civil existence in this period through a national economy and standardization of administration and law. And politics becomes essentially, this is my editorializing, politics becomes national in a sense. You have these new questions of legitimacy raised and a new model of social subordination. And this is it's all of these changes put together. That's where the need for that mass buy-in and new model of social subordination comes from. So it's electoral democracy and the emergence of mass politics. This is why you need these official traditions to kind of come to the fore. And I think he does a good job of illustrating just how many things have their origin in this period. I'm sure we'll get to some of them later, but one of them, Bastille Day, only 1880. I mean, I
Yeah.
was quite surprised. I thought
Mm.
that was going to be more from the late 18th century, but
And as he points out, the fall of the Bastille is like the easiest, most digestible bit of the French Revolution across French society, other than the proper reactionaries. Like that was a bit which like everyone's like, yeah, that 1789, that moment, that's fine. The rest of it,
yeah.
1780, 92, maybe too far, etc.
Yeah, I mean that's like people being freed from a prison. That's great. Too many people getting their head cut off. Some people think it's good. Some people think it's bad. That's harder to build consensus around. But no, I
And
think
it
that's
comes 10 years after the Paris Commune as well, importantly.
Yeah.
yes, good point.
Yeah, I know that's a great introduction, George. And in fact, it leads organically on to the next kind of question I wanted to ask, unless you wanted to throw something in.
I just wanted to quickly add in two brief things. One, it's worth recalling, and it's a book that we've considered maybe doing at some point, or sections of Arno Meyer's The Persistence of the Old Regime, which is until 1914, most of Europe was still rural, agrarian, conservative, aristocratic, monarchical. The exceptions to that, I mean, to a certain extent, Britain, more industrialized, more urban, and France and Switzerland, both, neither of them monarchies. But, these are very small exceptions to an overall picture. So I think it's worth bearing that in mind when we talk about things like, industrialization, urbanization, and so on. These are they're on the up. But they're still, still kind of in the minority.
And yet at the same time, you had, I think, it's fair to say, and you wouldn't need to be a Marxist to accept this, that obviously there was the sense of historical possibility and progress, and the sense of the possibility of conscious radical change was nonetheless much greater then than it is now, despite the fact, like you say, that you still had so much kind of encrusted inherited tradition, generalized backwardness, the remnants still of so much rural feudal life, industrialization, barely even registers in economic terms if you look at GDP figures, kind of projected back into that period. And so it's astonishing, that kind of disjuncture. On the one hand, the persistence of the old regime, at the same time as you had the kind of the future breaking through in a way that just seems kind of inconceivable now, with maybe the partial exception of kind of Musk colonizing Mars or whatever.
No, and indeed, you might argue that it's precisely that persistence of the old which gave such force to the new, that it had something to batter down. And that's both from the perspective of the left and the First and Second Internationals, as well as bourgeois modernization, etc. Even conservative forms of modernization, like under Bismarck or something, as well, kind of sought to kind of, in one way or another, break down the old while perhaps preserving some of it as well. The other element, just because you mentioned, kind of the manufacture of traditions, Hobsbawm notes that it has to be something that's generally discovered, but then it's completely reconceptualized and refabricated. So it's almost like you almost need the capacity for the industrialization of culture in some way already for this to be possible. And they don't, there might be raw material in the sense of something given by nature here meaning kind of spontaneous popular culture, but which is then taken, adapted and reshaped and resold back to people. And you need that to be a kind of almost industrial process. And that is probably not possible in an earlier phase of history.
And the repetition, I think, is also part of it. So it's a particular kind of, the tradition is created through the repetition, but in a sense, the repetition itself is an industrial effect rather than the kind of cyclical rhythm that I think would be associated with tradition in the past, or religion, the performance of religious ritual, which is oriented towards maintaining or structuring a certain kind of relationship with God or the divine. And that's different from the repetition of secular rituals in a particular context. And so this goes to the second question: is this mass production of loyalty? I think the overriding thrust of Hobsbawm's claim is that it did work. And I suppose it's interesting to think about, how do we know, how might we know whether or not it worked? I mean, both in terms of what Hobsbawm tells us, but also, if we try to apply other analytical frameworks or standards to test the claim that the mass production of loyalty actually did function. So Hobsbawm mentions, we've talked about Bastille Day, and then something which is quite late, in the 19th century that it becomes a centerpiece of Republican commemoration in France. But then you also have national ceremonies such as parades in Imperial Germany or parades in Imperial Britain, indeed. And he says that it's these kinds of efforts where there's a very self-conscious move by governments to use tradition in order to mount a project of social to maintain influence and political control. And the question, I guess, is how far do people buy into these things? So, you can see photos, and I think maybe even in the early 20th century, there might even be a few videos of I say videos, not videos, but very early cinematographic representations of some of the imperial rallies in Britain. Maybe I'm just misremembering that. But they're throng. You have thronging masses, and obviously it's impossible to get inside people's heads. But it's a question which kind of automatically follows how it looks like people supported. And I guess you could look at diary entries of the time, and there'll be various ways you could kind of investigate more deeply. Um, but yeah, how would you know? I mean, what would be a convincing account of whether or not it actually worked to mass produce loyalty? Because I don't think anybody's going to even, if you compiled, say, everyone who was keeping a private diary at the time, and they happened to go along to one of these imperial parades of the day, I doubt they would choose to describe their, how devoted they were to the government or the state in their private diary. So it's not clear to me that there's any way really to get into people's heads in order to prove the point.
Maybe there are two ways you could judge this, or at least two. And the one is that these things which were invented during that period have persisted. So what do you need for a nation in its kind of spectacular form? You need a flag, you need an anthem, you need some ceremonies, and you need some monuments. And all of these things, Hobsbawm says, are more or less, popularized. England had the first national anthem, I think it's 1770s, around them. But, this is when all these things became widespread. So that does make you think that there was a significant investment of people's, loyalty, and that had them
Yeah.
persist.
So, sorry, go on, George.
The other way, and I don't know if this is really his argument, but like you have to have quite a high level of mass support for the nation for people to fight in World War One and die in the numbers that they do. And that is quite a negative reading or negative vibe to bring in. But it's like, yeah, it did work. You can just you can count up the number of people who died in World War One, and that's like the proofs in the negative pudding. I don't know what exactly. I don't want to be disrespectful for people who did die, but it's like point. That I think is part of the logic of it. That what terminated the age of capital in Hobsbawm's account, well, it is the destruction of the First World War, and that is particularly European in origin, and it is about, or it depends on some mass production of loyalty. I would suggest.
So I mean, it's there are two thoughts, I guess. One is, I think, kind of emphasizing the upsurge of national feeling, kind of propelling all the nations of Europe to the outbreak of the war, understates the political calculations involved in particular moments. Not least in Germany, the Social Democrats, they genuinely, I think a significant portion of them genuinely did believe that if Germany was overrun by the Tsar, they would lose the democratic gains that the working class had made in Imperial Germany, rather than loyalty to the Kaiser directly. So that, I think it's those, and similar calculations, I think, would have been made by Republicans and liberals in Republican France, for instance. So I suppose the relationship between the national setting and the creation of national culture in that time and political calculation is something which I still, kind of is left open in my mind. But the other thing is, it's also interesting how these have changed, right? So Bastille Day is kind of very self-consciously attached to the formation of the modern French state, whereas the royal wedding, for instance, is very much something which is globalist now, in a very direct sense. It's something which is, it has wild kind of acclaim and support from around the world, and it doesn't seem to me that it has any meaningful relationship to loyalty to the British state.
Yeah,
It's
you have people coming over to visit London when there's
yeah,
a royal wedding. Who goes to visit France on Bastille Day? I mean,
squillions of people watch also on TV in a way that is has no bearing. And so I think British people, they watch it, but they don't. It's not something about cultivating their attachment to the British state in a way that it would have been in the past. So anyway, so it's.
Yeah.
I mean, I think
No, I
it's
mean, but
that's
that's
also
it.
interesting.
Yeah, I mean that's it. Like you can measure buy-in, but whether that buy-in means loyalty versus other competing claims made upon that individual, that family, etc. That's really hard to measure. I mean, we can. The only thing that kind of brings to mind in terms of getting into people's heads, and I think you've kind of made like oblique reference to this already. But if you think about the book, and I think the book's called Soldaten. It was in Germany, but like which looked at recordings and letters sent by German Wehrmacht soldiers, and I think in I don't know if they were on the front line or if they were in POW camps, but where, like, okay, how far has Nazi ideology, obviously this is taking things on a one or two steps further, let alone, kind of at least three decades further, where, how far does Nazi ideology, and particularly all its kind of, the kind of more esoteric elements of it, how much did that filter down into the average person, as represented by the kind of Wehrmacht soldier? And then they found actually relatively little. Actually, the themes were more about nation. So you could say, well, the nationalism definitely worked, but all the weird Nazi shit, not so much. But I don't know if, how much we could read or use that insight to read into the period of 1870 to 1914.
Yeah, so I mean, I know the book Soldaten. I've never read it cover to cover. I've got a, so I'm still living out of boxes due to my move to Ramsgate. So my copy of Hobsbawm is actually online for this session, and the book Soldaten I never read cover to cover. I've only kind of dipped in and out of it, and it's buried somewhere in the box, somewhere in the house. But I remember, I mean, something that if I recall rightly, right, again, it was interesting because even though they didn't see the deep imprint of Nazi ideology in terms of what the soldiers were kind of thinking in more private moments, that the political calculation was that we've got no choice but to keep on fighting because what's coming is so terrible, we have to kind of keep it at bay through fighting. And so the political, and also knowing what a terrible revenge the Russians would extract on their victory, knowing what had happened on the Eastern Front. So there was a political calculation made by individuals, by ordinary individuals, that they felt they were compelled to support the Nazi regime, particularly in the absence of alternatives, and because this terrible defeat was bearing down on them, that they just had to keep at bay for as long as possible. And so again, there's that point about how far individual political calculations end up reproducing a outcome associated with loyalty to a particular regime or state, even without buying into the mythical components of that particular political
Yeah.
order.
They take it seriously, not literally, perhaps, the way to put it.
Well, to coin a phrase, yeah. So it takes us to. I mean, this goes on. I mean, I've already kind of anticipated the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is about the continuity of these traditions and how far they survive, either by artifice or I say artifice, by conscious kind of political effort, or by that they've simply been embedded into folk memory. How far do they survive flags and anthems? If they were created to serve political purposes of creating national unity, does their survival indicate that they still serve the purpose of political unity?
yeah, it is a good question. I think they do still survive. I don't think they do serve the same purpose. I was trying to like, yeah. Sorry, I don't want to be too morbid, but the kind of the most recent national tradition moment that I can remember in this country was the death of the Queen. It wasn't a marriage; it was a death, and that feels like that was, there's people have made this analogy. It's almost a mourning for the kind of social democratic potential or past of Britain, and that there was some image that Queen Elizabeth kind of represented, but I don't think the people do still, I guess, do still have flags. Phil, you now live in a part of the world where Labour politicians have seen too many St George's crosses and
No, I haven't seen
turn their
any.
nose. Sorry.
Like I said, I haven't seen any.
Yeah.
But by the same token, I haven't seen in Canterbury. You will see Ukraine flags and Palestinian flags and trans stickers on lampposts and whatnot. I've not seen any of that at all. I saw Slavo Ukraina graffiti somewhere in Victory to Ukraine graffiti somewhere in Ramsgate. But other than that, what's remarkable to me is getting deeper into Kent. There's less, and particularly what's supposed to be the more conservative part of Kent compared to its cosmopolitan capital, Canterbury, is the absence of those political artifacts, Union flags or St. George's crosses or what have you.
I mean, the
Yeah.
obvious example is the United States, where anybody who's never been, or you go once and you're like, especially if you come from a European country, you're like, what the hell? Why are there these flags everywhere? Why do you need this to have an American flag on it? Product, actual flags, so lampposts, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And then I guess
Yeah.
the question is, does that serve the purpose of unity?
So for instance, a thing I did see also, like you'll see, like say a gay pride march will have American flags, whereas a
Yeah.
gay pride march in the UK won't have British flags, or at least I can't remember
Well,
anything
they'll have
like
that pink one, right? The kind of pinkified, yeah, Union Jack.
I haven't seen it. I mean, maybe occasionally, but where it's striking the way kind of in America, groups or I don't know if they say the Columbus Day Parade or whatever, there'll be American flags. The St. Paddy's Day Parade, there'll be American flags alongside the green and the Irish tricolor and whatever. There's a kind of there's a buy-in from various kind of communal expressions of identity in a way that I think is absent, at least in Britain. I don't know. I can't say about other states.
Well, I mean, I think about the Brazilian national football shirt, right? The Canadinho, the kind of iconic yellow shirt, which was captured by the right from kind of 2015 onwards in their demonstrations, first against the PT government and then in support of Bolsonaro, et cetera. And that was a symbol which was not at all politicized in any way and wasn't really manipulated. I mean, maybe there's a past under the military dictatorship, but even then, it was never. Yeah, it never had that role, and then suddenly it was taken up for obvious political purposes.
So I wanted to talk about this because we mentioned it in the past about how the everything that's kind of associated in the popular mind with Brazil from abroad, football, samba, Ipanema Beach, and whatever in Rio, that all of that was essentially the creation of the Vargas dictatorship, and then that kind of Brazil is gone now since the last 10, 20 years or so. So I wondered if you can tell us a bit more about that, because I know we've mentioned it kind of en passant, but maybe it'd be interesting to hear a bit more in this context.
Well, I mean, it's actually funny. I mean, just to mention, soccer and samba, which is that there's a meme in Brazil, which is like you post something with very Brazilian and it with a caption, this represents Brazil more than soccer and samba, right? And it's like, it could be anything from like a critique of inequality, saying, these kids are going hungry and there's so many new billionaires, this represents Brazil more than, or it can be kind of like funny, humorous of things, or two guys on a motorbike coming towards you and that you're worried that they're going to steal your handbag or your mobile phone or whatever. So there's lots of kind of little wry mentions to this to kind of counteract this stereotyped Brazil, which is inherited from the 40s, really blossoms in the 50s and 60s. So, I mean, I don't know what is your question? Like, I feel like I've just talked around it, but
Well, I suppose how far the question was, does the survival of certain of these now kind of deeply embedded in invented traditions, does it speak to their continuing political utility, or do they serve a different function in a different context? So royal weddings, I don't, for the example you
right.
talked about, they have no relationship, I think, in terms of loyalty to the British state anymore.
Well, so I think that Brazil, which is very and associated with Rio de Janeiro specifically, it was the capital until the early 60s. It's a and in contrast to the interiorization of the country, right? The move kind of inward, both São Paulo to a certain extent, and its mass industrialization, and then especially the move to the kind of the agrarian interior now, with kind of those are the places which are most booming. And in a way, that old Brazil, which was associated with also resistance to the military dictatorship through the 60s, is now a nostalgic and perhaps even melancholic cultural artifact or set of artifacts which have particularly appealed to progressive Brazil. Like, this is the Brazil we lost, which was neither so hyper commodified nor so authoritarian, or represented a certain different kind of form of life, a joie de vivre and whatever, as against our hyper conflictual times and Bolsonarismo
Yeah.
and its etc.
So we've batted this around before, Alex, and I'm curious to see, if you still hold to it, particularly in the context. I mean, I don't want to get too off topic, but I think it does thread through. And we've spoken about Brazilianization, a piece that the idea that you developed for an article in American Affairs a while back. But, you said part of the reason that people integrate into Brazilian identity so easily is because you kind of latch onto a few cultural things like carnival, or I don't know, wearing flip flops, or football, and then you're Brazilian. And part of the reason for that is because it's to do with the political structure of a country in which power and wealth is so tightly monopolized by a oligarchic ruling elite, and that there's no tradition of popular revolt, which, if there was,
There is, but yeah.
paradoxically, well, or a revolution kind of particular singular moments. I mean, so this is how I'm reframing your argument. So correct me if I'm wrong when I'm done. But there aren't singular moments of the assertion of popular sovereignty in a way that's parallel to most European states. And so as a result, at the same time, it is kind of more paradoxically, it's more inclusive for that. Is that right?
Yes, no, that is right. That is, and I would more or less hold to that. And actually, we're going to come on to, I think it's the last question on the agenda, but maybe we'll do this now that we're here. So I was looking through kind of, okay, really trying to think through invention of tradition in Brazil, and Phil, you've already touched on some of those elements, but it still remains the fact that it feels like the invention of tradition, a la kind of Hobsbawm and Ranger described there, was much less of a factor in Brazil, partly because even as Brazil begins to modernize and industrialize from 1870 onwards, it's still much more agrarian, much more dispersed, etc., such that you don't have the functional need for the invention of tradition, which the British ruling class had very obviously. So there's that. And then by the time you have kind of a very rapid modernization and you have the working class pressing up, you have dictatorship, which comes in. And the dictatorship probably has less need of ideological devices because it's just crude force, coercion, which comes in place for that. So I think there's a part of the history which kind of explains why it's less present in Brazil. The other thing is, which you kind of already hinted at, is precisely that gaping inequality and a sense of the people kind of being left to their own devices, right? So even Mexico, which is kind of maybe in terms of social structure a bit similar, has these great moments of revolution, of great disjuncture from one phase of history to another. And there's a very evident, when you go to, I went to Mexico at the end of last year, and there's very evident, I don't know, prostitution is the wrong word, but the revolutions, the Mexican Revolution is forced down your throat, which wasn't the terms that I would wish to put it in. But anyway, like it's very there, it's very present in monuments and museums, et cetera, right? And it clearly has served a purpose and maybe serves a purpose, but it's there. And it's an element of national pride.
But the logic would be then that it'd be harder to become Mexican because you have that moment of state founding and popular sovereignty in a way that you don't in Brazil.
I think that might be true. I mean, I'd be interested to know anybody who's listening to this who knows Mexico well, or indeed maybe Roger Lancaster, if he's listening to this, who's lived there for a long time and studied there, if he has any insight into this. But yeah, I would suspect that it's harder to become Mexican than it is to become Brazilian, which is just more capacious, and you're kind of left to your own devices. I mean, something which, this is a bit tangential, but I was watching this film over the weekend, which is really good. It's called Don't Expect Too Much from the End of the World, which is a Romanian film, very postmodern but great, really biting satire. It's a bit long, but anyway, two moments in it. One, there's this the main character who's like both an Uber driver and a PA for a filming company there, who's kind of constantly driving around, harassed, very tired. Her mother is like going on about the Queen and whether the Queen has just died or something, and she means, of course, the British Queen, right? And so it's obviously, it is a global cultural phenomenon, the British Queen, and the role that she played, and it's mainly carried on the backs of your mom or your aunt, right? Like this is the demographic which is most into it.
Yeah.
So that was one thing. But the thing more appropriate to this is like this corporate elite type from Austria comes in, and the main character is driving her along. The Austrian is sitting in the back seat, and she's obviously kind of a bit pretentious and whatever. But they're talking about road safety in Romania, and she said, yeah, there's this road which everyone dies, and it's like a single lane, and whatever, and that there's more crosses along the road commemorating road deaths than there are kilometers along the road. And it is quite grim. And then the Austrians like, but why doesn't anybody do anything about that? All they need to do is station police. And it's like, well, we're on our own here. Like, the public authority doesn't care about this. And I was like, oh yeah, well, I mean, I identified with that very much in Brazil. There's a lot which is just like, they don't care. Like, what do you? It's almost almost to be asked the question is to kind of go, your voice goes, what? Because you're like, what? Obviously not. No. And anyway, so I think there's a kind of analogy to kind of in terms of culture, symbols, etc., and national belonging, which is like, we don't really care about you as long as you're not and you'll be met with naked repression if you do start causing a fuss. But otherwise, you're left to your own devices, which means that popular culture perhaps has remained more vital and alive, and maybe a little bit less commodified than it has in the North.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because I would hazard to say that I think Britain is probably kind of close, more in the Romania camp than it would have been in the past.
For sure,
That sense of state dysfunction and abandonment. Obviously, it's been a long time in coming, given kind of constant gouging through privatization and neoliberalization, but particularly since lockdown and austerity, say from 2008 onwards, that sense of the kind of that you would kind of laugh at the idea that public authority would be expected to do something about it, not only in poor areas, but even in kind of fairly middle class or ordinary working class areas. That is very real. So that's I guess that goes to the next question. Well, no, it doesn't actually, but we can do the next question.
I'll just put intermission music here.
No, just leave that professional segue. Yeah, this goes to the next question. It doesn't actually, but we're going to do it anyway.
I jumped. So Alex has mentioned the kind of invention of tradition in the Brazilian context is different, because military dictatorship means that there was less need for the creation of popular symbols of rule by the time that you had a working class, but also the pace of industrialization was less. So in Hobsbawm's case, the first period of globalization, he very explicitly, as we've said, ties this invention of tradition to industrialization, urbanization, railways, mass media. I suppose the question is, is there a deeper connection? It's not just that industrialization creates the need for collective symbols of unity, but does the greater capacity of technical modernization, does it make it easier to do these kinds of things? And how far is it deliberate strategy, I guess? The question, and we'll come back to this, but the question hanging over this is what happens, I suppose, in the deindustrializing or post-industrial context as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's worth just this might be an obvious point for listeners, but the mass production or mass producing traditions, it kind of has those two meanings. One is production en masse, and the other is production by the masses. And I think it is worth just highlighting that. And maybe the question made me think maybe Hobsbawm's treatment doesn't look at technology as much as it could. It made me think of Benjamin and this idea of the work of art in the age of mechanical reproducibility. You can mass produce icons. You could churn out these. I don't know why my mind went to this straight away. This is very, very revealing. But like a mug with a Union Jack on that you could
just like love tea.
Because I love tea. I mean, we've established this. I've owned up to it. But you can actually really pump those objects out, those commodities, those icons. And I don't think he really kind of looks at this, unless I'm kind of misremembering. It is more about I think he runs it through. Here's the political changes and the changes to the state that happen through the industrial period, and so therefore here's the political kind of need that it's filled. He doesn't look at like what is the first, I don't know, national souvenir or national trinket, and
Yeah, that kind of stuff would actually be fascinating. I'm
Yeah.
sure somebody's looked at it somewhere, but yes.
I was going to say the first fridge magnet, but that's, this is considerably before fridges, but you know what I mean.
That's a good point. Yeah, I mean, they probably
maybe
didn't have
somebody made a.
they didn't have that many magnetic surfaces. Yeah,
somebody made the fridge magnets, anticipating fridges.
Yeah,
that's big brain stuff.
I suppose urbanization. I mean, modern transport and urbanization makes it easier to concentrate people and to familiarize them with high degrees of social organization, which allows for regimentation. It's also the time when you'd have, at least in European states, mass conscription as well. So the idea of kind of popular thronging to public spaces would have been much more familiar, as well as perhaps also religiosity, kind of the fact that people would have gone to public meetings and churches religiously, so to speak, every week, would also give them a more spontaneous understanding of public coordination in a way that I think is essentially absent with the exception of mass sporting events today.
Well, so
at least in the Western world.
So, I mean, didn't Horkheimer and Adorno already answer this question nearly 100 years ago? I mean, no, we don't need to buy all the conclusions of the culture industry, but it would seem to be that pacification, to put it again, I don't necessarily want to endorse it entirely, but the pacification was bought through the kind of mass production of culture. And this is different from what we've been discussing, or you're just describing, Phil, in terms of the politically directed invention of traditions, which seems to me much more directed to a kind of pre-consumer but already industrial mass society. And that after the Second World War, really beginning in the United States, but now basically everywhere in the world, that kind of the change to mass culture, from popular culture to mass culture, has kind of resolved that question, or taken the place that, military parades, wearing the poppy, etc., used to take.
Yeah. I mean, I think I would agree. There's another question hanging over all of this, and we'll maybe come back to it at the end, which is how far any of this stuff now is just for the tourists. Is there really anything meaningful about any of this? Maybe the French state kind of goes through rehearses. Macron kind of tries to look tough, turning up to the, turning up to Bastille Day military parade. I don't know if there's more. Maybe some
in Western Europe,
I was going to say, maybe Victory Day in Russia, maybe that does still have, it's not kind of entirely tainted by the Putin regime, and maybe it still has kind of a deep popular resonance. I don't know, maybe our listeners can tell us.
Or maybe Turkey, I think there's probably multiple examples of from Turkey.
I would hazard yes, but I wouldn't rush to it either. The next kind of question we've got a couple, but kind of drawing to a close. But how far are these ideas of invented tradition universal? So we've mentioned it to some degree with respect to the US, Brazil, and Europe, and it's one of the academic criticisms of Hobsbawm in this text as being that it's too Eurocentric, notwithstanding the other contributions in the book. But how far does inventing tradition apply beyond? I mean, I'd like specific concrete examples if people can think of them, either our listeners or you guys now, and how far we're still mass producing traditions in the same way, if we are indeed at all.
I mean, I'm sure the Thai monarchy is pretty busy at the tradition factory. If not creating and inventing, certainly reproducing, in what is otherwise a pretty modern society, But
I expect China as well, but I don't know what it would be. I'm not quite sure. I suppose you'd have to be there, because the thesis, if it's right, that it's the kind of industrial pace of change, you'd expect it in countries that are industrializing. Bangladesh, Vietnam, Malaysia, perhaps. Perhaps in Korea back in the 80s and 90s, you'd expect.
I don't know if those are industrializing. I mean, the that phase was probably the 70s and 80s.
But South Korea, but Vietnam, Bangladesh, to a lesser extent perhaps, but those, where you still have industrialization as a process that's being rolled out, pockets of East Africa, Southeast Asia and East Asia, that's where it's still kind of happening.
Well, I mean, the populational thing is so different, right? Sorry, I'll just very briefly, but it's like industry is not manufacturing is not absorbing that many people. right? So you don't have an industrial proletariat. You have the creation of, as Robert Kurz calls them, monetary subjects without money. But, basically an urbanized, kind of proletarianized mass of people, but who are not engaged in industry.
I guess you need to see more. Yeah, George, come on. I mean, more on the facts and figures. But George, yeah, come on in.
Yeah, no, I get it. You have to be quite specific about what he's claiming, I think, in order to answer this question. And is what he's claiming nations have traditions? Well, yeah, I think this is universal. To the extent that you have nations, they have some kind of lived element that brings a populace into them, and these is then the kind of to narrow the thesis down a little bit. Is it that these traditions are invented in the sense of they are more recent than they purport to be or they're felt to be, and that they happen during the period of greatest industrial change? And I think that is a fairly testable thesis, and I think that might well be right. But I'm just was thinking about China, and I don't know if that does apply or not. I don't know what exactly.
Did you have any kind of sense of it when you were there? This is some time ago now, but
Yeah, no, not really. I think it was hard to participate or to kind of be involved in the kind of the national traditions. Obviously, you've got kind of Chinese New Year, and that's a massive internal migration and reorganization of people, and there's all these kind of traditions that are associated with that. But for Hobsbawm to be right, those things would have to have all come up during Mao years, perhaps, and
or
to
have been significantly altered from their traditional rural kind of basis.
yeah. And that's
Which I'm sure is true. It must have happened even without knowing much
I
about
think
it.
some listeners, some big brain listeners, might have some thoughts on this, because it's a good question. I don't feel
What about
like I can answer it.
What about Carnival? So, because does that allow you to connect to the Brazilian state or some kind of Brazilian community? No?
No. I mean, and I think that the issue here is, and the only way to ask it is a bit counterfactually, but like, what are the competing demands upon your loyalty as a citizen, subject, etc. today? And there aren't many, I don't think, in the kind of pacified post-historical societies in which most of us live. There aren't that many demands on you in terms of cultural in terms of
There are ways to absorb you, but not
religious
the kind of not competing kind of folky of obligation.
Yeah, well, I mean, because I'm kind of slightly jumping ahead to your next question, but I think it's a way of answering it, which is you ask, and it's a good question, and you did it last session as well, and I think it's a good, like, what's a non-Marxist account of the same thing look like, right? And there obviously the tendency is to be like, oh well, class struggle, right, and the demands of loyalty to class rather than nation, and that's the big conflict. But it's not only that, right? Because Hobsbawm also refers to, monarchical, so I have my loyalty to the king, not to the nation. And who does that king represent versus what does the nation represent? Or to religion, and that might be in a transnational sense of Catholicism or Islam, or it might be in a more local sense. You might have regional demands, etc., right? Which are, and the regional ones aren't of a nation state. And it has no aspirations to be a nation state, perhaps. It's just, what are the competing demands upon your loyalty today? Well, I mean, arguably you could say that there aren't any, but because public authority doesn't care about you, public authority doesn't need you. So they're not asking for your part. This is what the truth of post-mass politics is that the church isn't. Maybe some churches are asking, and maybe some religions are asking for your involvement, particularly in terms of radical Islam, etc. But by and large, no one's really asking for your attention, for your loyalty, for your commitment, and for your active participation.
Or maybe they are asking for your attention more than your commitment.
Right. Yes.
Spectate. Yeah. Believe. You don't have to belong. You don't have to do anything. Just kind of, yeah.
But you can spectate. You can spectate at many things, and it's a fairly passive.
It's fairly low. Yeah, you can multi-screen. All the different things you need to spectate.
That's good. Nice. Yeah.
Right. So green, I think ideology would be the most obvious ones, where the constant sense of guilt, I suppose, and then kind of the need for action, but there's no actual. It's not. There's no concrete institutional basis for authority or loyalty that comes out of it.
Well, guilt is interesting because I was trying to think of other kind of examples, and I thought of like the 1619 Project in the U.S. You know, it tries to, but listeners are probably familiar, but it tries to trace the country's founding to the moment that slaves first arrived on American shores, rather than the American Revolution. And this is obviously, historiographically very sketchy and politically damaging and incorrect and whatever, right? And you know what it erases, it has a conservative function in erasing any vestige of revolutionary history to the United States, even if it's in liberal terms. So anyway, but what is it, how does it does try to create a kind of new national mythos, right? The 1619 Project, except it does it on the basis mostly of guilt, right? Of complicity in slavery, in which no one really is able to claim that you're not gonna like wave the flag. I mean, maybe if you're a black nationalist, you do, but then that's against an idea of a comprehensive America, which includes all its
But it's
people.
moral
So
superiority, isn't it?
right,
So
yeah. So it doesn't perform the same function.
recognition,
Yeah,
yeah, by recognition and recognition of the sin, and in rectifying, kind of making penance for it, institutionalizing penance for it, and appropriate demonstrations of guilt and institute reparations, I guess, whether literal or metaphorical, political reparations of various kinds, justifying authority on the basis of the defense and restitution of vulnerable minorities in the present. That becomes the basis of authority. But that's the state. That's a liberal kind of attempt to redefine the liberal state. It doesn't compete really with, it's not like offered as an alternative to, it's an attempt to reframe the basis of state authority and legitimacy in a liberal progressive way at the height of the BLM politics. But, it doesn't function otherwise. So what about then this? Is there, if we accept the idea that you had industrializing societies, rapid change, urbanization, and so on, have a need for forming new symbols of cohesion, is there a way to provide an account of this period that is kind of non-Marxist? I suppose, the obvious one is to say, well, it just doesn't, it's not real. All the traditions are actually, they're not fake. They're all meaningful and genuine. I don't mean anything so crude. I just mean if you accept some of the basic premises about the pace of industrial change and the need for cohesion in this new context of late 19th century Europe, is there a way to provide an account that would look different from Hobsbawm's?
Yes.
Well, tell us.
Okay.
What would it look like?
So one thing which I was thinking of is a really good paper, and we'll link to it in the show notes, but it's about all traditions are invented, or all social practices, all social norms have to have an origin. And the question that this paper asks is it easier to explain where social norms come from or how they persist? And the two examples used are foot binding and infibulation. If you don't know what infibulation is, a listener, look it up. It's no bueno. But so these are two very damaging practices specifically to women. And what the paper does is provide an explanation of how these two practices emerged, which is very sketchy historically, but then how they spread, how they diffused. And I think I would probably call it a Weberian account. It's this idea that essentially how you get mass adherence to a social norm, which is, I think, another way to describe a tradition, is downwards diffusion. So you essentially have, if you have a status hierarchy, in foot binding is a good example. First of all, it's just the emperor and his concubines, and then it goes down to upper middle class families, and soon everyone's doing it. And nobody really knows where it came from. And it actually is extremely damaging because, not only does it obviously break the feet of Chinese women for generations, but also makes them unable to work in a variety of different contexts, which then become important. Foot binding has been ended, infibulation hasn't. So I guess the non-Marxist explanation would have to look at I guess rather than the kind of, I think Hobsbawm takes different classes and essentially shows how maybe the state has one method of inventive tradition, working class has another, the upper middle class through schooling, through tennis has another, and instead say, well, actually, what are the kind of social functions of these traditions that mean that if you don't subscribe to them, you can kind of be excluded, or that idea of Weberian idea of closure, you don't get the access from the benefits of the group. I mean, I'm trying to be,
No, but I think that's good.
last
I think
time I
that's
was
right.
like, no, Marxism's
No,
right,
no, it's
everything else
good.
is wrong.
No,
So
no,
I
no.
wanted to throw this in there.
But
This
there is
good.
that's just the kind of, stuff that no, I was going to say the stuff just happens school of thought, because it isn't that, right? Because it's not just random, but it's like it gets started and then it continues because people, maybe again here, you want to emulate your social betters and that's it. And there's no kind of more functional account of
Yes,
elite
it's not
interests
really
and so on.
political, but
It's
But
it
how
yeah.
would
reinforces hierarchy, but it's not consciously
right?
designed as
And how would
So
we set up like Gellner? Because Gellner's not a Marxist. Who we're going to come to. I don't want to jump ahead because that's in 2 months' time. But Gellner's is an account which is functionalist
more about
about
byproduct, isn't it?
yeah.
Kind of. And
Well,
so
I
it's
was just going to
social
explain what it is
needs.
for listeners' sake. But I mean, basically, for the needs of a coherent national economy, you need to have people all speaking the same language and whatever. And that's how you so you need to bind people together for purposes, but it's not to dissuade them from revolution and etc. So that's where it's non-Marxist.
yeah.
So this. Sorry, yeah, go on, George.
No, so I guess the non-Marxist explanation would be, instead of these traditions having, oh yeah, maybe it, maybe they're both functional. I mean, there's a whole argument in the literature: is Marxism functionalist or not? Listeners can read their GA Cohen on this, but it would be that it essentially doesn't really matter where these traditions come from. That's kind of random, or who like how they start. It's about how they diffuse and who benefits from within society. Maybe I'm stretching that Weberian account
No,
towards
I think
Marxism
that's
anyway,
right.
but I do find that Hobsbawm's kind of, why it's a powerful account is because he situates it historically, and he shows why these traditions emerge at this point in time due to this sort of the changes in politics. And I don't think non-Marxist account can do that quite so easily.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think it's kind of, you can look at it from the other way, which is it possible to have a coherent kind of theory of power linked to social conflict without that understanding of the class divisions opened up by industrialization and the social antagonism that comes with it. So that takes us to my final kind of theme, which I wanted to talk about in relation to the Hobsbawm chapter, which is invented traditions in 2025. So Hobsbawm, writing about pre-World War One globalization, what would he say about today's traditions? National holidays, for instance, or global events like the Olympics, would they count as mass-produced traditions? The notorious example, I guess, would be the 2012 Olympics in Britain and the opening ceremony, which is still kind of taken by many of the liberal middle classes as the high point of British identity before we were plunged into the darkness of the Brexit years and everything since. I mean, it left me completely cold, I have to say. I thought Peter Hitchens gave the most compelling account of the vacuity of the Olympic opening ceremony of that time in
I think a
London.
listener has already called us up on us making too frequent reference to that, so maybe we shouldn't do it again.
Well, fair enough, right? If I don't wish to
Look,
harp
some
on
people are still living in 2012.
But maybe
it's
you
not
guys, maybe
it's
this
not
is
the
your
libs,
invented
it's
tradition.
Phil.
You're
no,
like,
no,
the
no, no.
the libs tortured me with their 2012 Olympics.
They did. But that's not. I'm genuinely struggling to find other examples. I suppose the reason that example comes to me is because there are very few. We mentioned the British example, the funeral of the Queen, and that's, say, on a different scale to the funeral of Jimmy Carter. The Olympics is the closest thing you get to um, mass orchestration of national identity in a very explicitly kind of depoliticized environment where the competition is sublimated into sport. So I think it is, and also at the same time, it's the liberal kind of attachment to 2012 indicates it's something which was manufactured for them rather than for crude, kind of primitive, atavistic nationalists. So, if the listeners forgive me for going on about it, I struggle to think of other examples. The social media campaigns count. There was an argument that John MacDonald, the Corbynist chancellor, and Jeremy Corbyn, back when he was leader of the Labour Party, that they were going to introduce national holidays based on saints' days for the UK. St. Patrick, St. David, St. George.
St. George's Day. St. George's Day is coming up. It's the 23rd of April.
So would that count? Would that count as an invented tradition today?
Well, it didn't happen.
So I let me.
Well, indeed, but if it did, I guess is what I'm asking.
So I'm going to say something. I haven't read his work in full, but I'm kind of familiar enough. So Byung-Chul Han has this book called something like The Disappearance of Rituals, right? And I think it's very, very kind of apposite for this discussion because he kind of understands rituals as kind of stabilizing life and anchoring people in time. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it's him who says, I might get this wrong, so correct me, that rituals are to time as home is to place, right? So they kind of anchor you in, it's a moment in time which is repeated. That this national holiday will come about, this ceremony, etc., right? And that gives a certain regularity. And for him now, like, time is completely fragmented. People's experience of time is non-commensurable with someone else's, and it's completely flattened as well. So because of this lack of kind of belonging and identity, the ritual in which, in some sense, time stands still, right? Everybody is doing the same thing at the same time in a society which is now a 24-hour society where everybody's demands are placed on you for your attention all the time. And indeed, like, no one's going to be, in Britain, for example, Britain or the US, there's not going to be a moment, a holiday where everyone stops working. There's going to be loads of people working, even on the 4th of July or even maybe Christmas Day. I don't know, but there's going to be people at work. And so this kind of demand of like 24-hour society kind of defuses the capacity for ritual and the function that ritual might play, because nothing ever kind of stops at the same time. So I guess that's sort of like.
However, it's so funny that you mentioned rituals, because I was gonna make a similar but less theoretically sophisticated point that we don't seem to have like traditions. We have micro traditions, which are maybe rituals. Maybe rituals are just like short traditions. I was trying to think so I was watching the football this weekend and the players took the knee. This is one micro tradition or one ritual which seems.
So they're still doing that in football then, huh?
Surprisingly,
it went away and then they came back. It's bizarre.
It's surprising. And
but that must be Trump. So Trump's back. That's why they're doing it.
Maybe.
Yeah,
another thing that I was thinking in the British context is kind of clapping for carers. I was thinking like maybe people have
That was a lockdown ritual.
Yeah, maybe people have the effective like support for the NHS. So there could be like a micro tradition around support for the NHS more easily than a new invented tradition to display loyalty to the British state, because that's not really going to happen. But no, it seems like there is they're not mass produced. They're kind of more, they're much smaller. Whatever the big traditions were that the state was able to kind of command our loyalty or manufacture it or encourage us to do it or whatever, it seems like it's on a much smaller scale now.
It's a great example though, also because it's at home. The clapping for carers thing. So you were in lockdown, so there was no kind of public concentration, because obviously that would risk kind of spreading the virus. And so you showed your kind of support for the state and protecting the NHS. So you're protecting it by being, absent from public and consenting to this kind of enforced privatization. And so it's a very fragmented repetition rather than mass concentration of public loyalty and affection for the symbols of the state. And it's a National Health Service, so it's a symbol of the kind of clamoring for the welfare state, I guess, rather than the protective kind of functions, the biopolitical functions of the state, rather than its kind of celebrating its kind of martial prowess.
It probably wasn't a true invented tradition in that it wasn't sold to us as like we have always been the clappers. We have always clapped.
Exactly. Yes, it's not from time immemorial, right? It's a neo ritual. But I think so. I think
it's a very interesting example. I think
it is. But I suspect our conclusion is that there aren't really invented traditions. There's not a process of inventing traditions today, and I at least that would be my kind of provisional conclusion. And I wonder what my answer will be 5 years from now, because as we know, the end of history is in full force, and the increase in kind of national competition, rivalries, even potentially war, I think will transform. I mean, ostensibly we will create the need for these questions of loyalty. I mean, Trump is deporting people who have been quote unquote, unloyal, right? So this would be an interesting discussion to have in 5 years' time, or even maybe 3 years' time.
I suspect there'll be less change than we think. I mean, not to say that there won't be war, but I think it will. The interpassivity is so deeply embedded in modern society, I think, so that they will still have kind of be heavily mediated, spectacle-based, consumption-based, rather than directly involving people in large displays of public support. I think it'll be more like that. Support our troops.
What symbols you put on social media? Yeah,
it'll be more of that. Yeah, I mean, maybe that is an invented tradition: is the flag emoji in your social media profile, and that's something which kind of interfaces both with a popular kind of bottom down.
You have to be a real sado to do it.
I do it, but I have the flags of. I just have flags that I like, that I find aesthetically pleasing. Seychelles, Marshall Islands.
The ironic response is the worst one.
It's not ironic. It's a genuine appreciation. I like flags.
Well,
anyway.
Maybe we can leave it there. The next one in this cycle makes a slight departure because it's far less well known than the text we've been doing so far. It's an Dutch anthropologist, though he has been based in Britain for a while, and in fact, it's not a published work, at least not published in English, but a PhD, some chapters of his PhD looking at anti-nationalism in the context of the breakdown of Yugoslavia.
It's a real deep cut. It's really
it's a hipster choice.
It's such a hipster choice.
I'm not sure it's a hipster choice, and I'll explain.
It's a B-side. It's an unpublished B-side.
It's definitely a B-side. It's a B-side take, and I'll explain in more detail my decision to use it as the text for us for our next session. But anyway, you can find the link in the Reading Club notes for listeners and viewers to get ahead of to get reading it. We won't be reading the whole PhD, and we'll be reading selections of it. But I hope the content will bear out the choice to use an unpublished text. So look forward to seeing you guys then, and look forward to hearing. Send us your questions and comments to the Reading Club.
And it should be said actually that we haven't been dealing with your questions and comments so far because what we want to do and what we intend to do is the fourth episode in each block will be recorded live. It'll be a live stream, which you'll be welcome to, we encourage you to join us for and ask your questions then. So we'll have a big discussion about all the themes of the block as a whole rather than the specific text in the fourth session. So that will be in July, and we'll obviously announce the dates. But we hope you will join us for that. Okay, I think we can leave that there. Catch you next time. Bye-bye.